So it's my pleasure to begin by introducing our first speaker, Dr. David B. Resnik. Dr. Resnik is a bioethicist at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences of the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Resnik has an MA and PhD in philosophy from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, as well as a JD from Concord University School of Law, and a BA in philosophy from Davidson College. Dr. Resnik was an associate and full professor of medical humanities at the Brody School of Medicine at East Carolina University from 1998 to 2004, and an associate director of the Bioethics Center at ECU and University Health Systems from 1998 to 2004. Dr. Resnik was assistant and associate professor of philosophy at the University of Wyoming from 1990 to 1998, and director of the Center for the Advancement of Ethics there from 1995 to 1998. Dr. Resnik has published over 300 articles and 10 books on various topics in philosophy and bioethics, and is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He serves on several editorial boards and is an associate editor of the journal Accountability in Research. So it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much, Dr. Resnik, and I'll turn it over to you to speak to us.
Thank you, Kevin. It's an honor and a privilege to be invited to talk today. I'm going to share my screen. So it looks like everybody can see hopefully everybody sees what I got up there. Okay, so I'm going to talk about decision-making under scientific and moral uncertainty today, and its implications for PFAS testing. So let's just start off with a very simple example of a decision. Suppose we're thinking about investing $10,000. And we have here some different options for this investment: stocks, bonds, mutual funds, different conditions or states of the world, a growing economy, a stable economy, or a shrinking economy. And then also we have different outcomes that can happen from those decisions. You can see how stocks perform the best under a growing economy, but they perform the worst under a shrinking economy. And so you can see the other sorts of values you would have up there. And what you're trying to do is maximize your investment on this $10,000. Where we can consider a medical treatment decision where we have a 65-year-old man that's been diagnosed with prostate cancer. And we have different options here: just surveillance of the cancer, not doing anything, radiation therapy, hormone therapy, and having a radical prostate, having prostate removed. So the world could be different ways. It could be the cancer is aggressive. We don't really know that. Or the cancer is non-aggressive. And we have different outcomes here. If you're just surveilling the thing and it's a cancer aggressive, we could say you're only going to live 1 year. But if it's non-aggressive, you could live up to 15 years when you're doing nothing but surveilling it. And then I've just thrown up some other possible outcomes for those other options as well. And here we're only considering life expectancy. We're not considering other things in this decision like quality of life or financial costs. So in this type of situation, we face uncertainty. There's different kinds of uncertainty. Epistemological or scientific uncertainty is uncertainty with respect to knowledge or belief due to incomplete or inconclusive evidence. And it's worth remembering that scientific knowledge is empirical and it's never absolutely certain. The only way we can really get certainty in the world is through mathematical or logical knowledge. Axiological or moral or social or political uncertainty is different. That's uncertainty with respect to decisions or actions due to lack of justification, clarity, or agreement about our values. So we have sort of a scientific uncertainty is one way of looking at things, and also value uncertainty. It's important to remember that uncertainty has to do with the degree or level of evidence or justification. Should not be equated with a feeling, although often when we lack justification or evidence, it gives us feelings of uncertainty. And very often in decisions, we'll see we face both types of uncertainty, epistemological and value uncertainty. So looking at just at the investment example, our knowledge uncertainty would be things like, do I know whether the economy will shrink, grow, or be stable? Do I know how my different investments will perform? And what evidence do I have for my beliefs? As far as values are concerned, how much do I care about gaining money, not losing money? What other values affect my decision? And one way of thinking about these values sometimes is people may be risk averse. That is, there are some people, it's just where their value structures, they don't like taking risks. And also people, as part of their value structure, maybe they don't like losing things. Even if there's more potential gain to be had, they'd rather take less of a loss. As far as the prostate treatment example goes, knowledge concerning whether the tumor is aggressive, we might not know that, and we don't know how it might respond to different treatments. We don't know how these treatments will affect me as a patient, and we want to know what evidence my doctor has for these beliefs. And also our value uncertainty. There are other values at stake just besides length of life for this treatment. What about quality of life? These different treatments could affect quality of life in very fundamentally different ways. For example, a prostatectomy could seriously impact quality of life by leading to having sexual function problems and bladder problems and things like that. In thinking about uncertainty, it's important to remember that probability is different from uncertainty. People often speak of these two things in the same breath, but they're different. So think about it this way. If the weather forecast says that today there will be a 50% chance of rain, we have a probability there, but we might say that this is an uncertain probability because how accurate are weather forecasts, how reliable are they? It could be still uncertain even though we have a probability. Or compare a 1/6 chance of rolling a fair die and getting a 6, according to mathematical probabilities. That's a certain probability in the theory that you will have a 1/6 chance here. Now, there are different ways of estimating probabilities, and I don't know if this will come up in our discussions today. They can be based on mathematical relationships, observed frequencies or statistical probabilities, if systems analysis, engineering modeling of systems, and educated guesses or subjective probabilities. So one way of making these decisions, it's very popular in science, medicine, and business, is expected utility theory. So what you do is you make the decision that maximizes your overall expected utility, which is a sum of the different expected utilities for the options. Your expected utility is a function, is your probability times your utility. And your utilities are based on your preferences or values. Utilities must also conform to some mathematical and logical conditions like consistency, ordering, and transitivity. Things like cost-benefit analysis, environmental risk assessment, evidence-based medicine, they try to implement this kind of evidence-based approach to decision-making. So if we apply this to the investment example, as you can see there, what I've done is I've stuck in a 0.5. I've said there's a point just thrown up there as 0.5 probability for growing economy and 0.25 each for the stable economy. I multiplied the utilities by these probabilities. We add everything up, and just under this example, it shows you that stocks have the best overall expected utility under these different possible outcomes with these probabilities thrown in there, and bonds are doing the worst. If you just, again, these are all just hypothetical numbers thrown up there again. Let's assume there's only a 15% chance the cancer is aggressive versus 85% chance it's non-aggressive. We put those numbers in there, we multiply them by our utilities, and then turns out that under this sort of analysis, the prostatectomy turns out to be the highest total expected utility because you always get 14 years of life expected no matter whether the cancer is aggressive or non-aggressive. So these are very simple, idealized examples. But in the real world, there may be many different options, including combinations of options. There may be many different outcomes, including some outcomes that are not very realistic and must be ruled out for the purposes of decision making. There may be probabilities that may be uncertain. So we really can't rely on those probabilities. And also we're not accounting for attitudes toward risk and loss. And also values may be uncertain because we don't know what values should be a priority when our values are incommensurable. For example, how could you put a price on human life? How can you compare quality of life to the length of life? How do you factor economic values into that, and so forth? So what should we do when we lack scientific uncertainty for these decisions? Because we just don't have enough evidence to be confident in our probability estimates due to, we have inconclusive evidence. Well, one thing that some people propose is you continue to work with expected utility theory, but you use subjective probabilities. So you just take your best guess for the probabilities, you put them in to your decision calculus, and that's how you go forward. The problem I have, and a lot of others have, with using subjective probabilities is that these are very subject to initial biases, and they are not going to be, these biases may not be overcome by Bayesian updating, using Bayes' theorem to update your subjective probabilities in light of new evidence. So you could start out with wildly, different if you have, based on different probabilities you put in there from subjective guesses, you could get very different decisions, and these might be biased. So we could have a discussion about this, but let's just say for now that using subjective probabilities is not really the way we want to go on something like this. So if you're not going to take this decision-making under risk or expected utility theory approach, decision theorists have another way of making decisions, and they've developed some rules for making decisions under ignorance. That is, where you don't know any probabilities, and you're just trying to make decisions based on just different rules. So one of these rules is called max-min, and this is, you choose the outcome with the highest worst outcome. Sorry, you choose the option with the highest worst outcome. And under this, it would say that you should choose bonds as your option because the worst you can do is lose $2,000. Max is a more optimistic way of looking at things, and it would say you should choose stocks because the best outcome is you gain $10,000. And then minimax regret rule is you choose the option with the lowest regret, and that turns out to be mutual funds of the regret of only $6,000. And then there's the principle of indifference, where you just assume that all probabilities are equally probable. So our outcomes are equally probable, and that would recommend stocks. Again, we could apply this to treating the cancer, the prostate cancer, and you get, it's going to max-min. The worst would recommend getting your prostate removed because the worst you can do is get 14 years of life. But if you're more optimistic, you'd say surveillance because you can actually get this outcome of 15 years of life under this option. And then again, minimax regret would say get a prostatectomy because the worst you can do is have a regret of 1 year loss of life. Well, there are problems with these rules that you might use from formal decision theory. First of all, they're highly simplistic and idealized. They also assume a very small range of options, but in the real world, there may be many different possible outcomes that may not be realistic, that could radically change the way you look at the decision if you throw those possible outcomes in there. They also assume, and this is a problem really for all this formal decision theory, that you have some kind of assignment or ranking of utilities. But in the real world, we're dealing with value uncertainty. So people are going to disagree about the utilities, about their values. And this is especially true when we're making social policy decisions. And it's also difficult to know which rule to use. Some rules are very risk averse, some are very much risk taking, and some are in between both of these things. So if we are faced with scientific and possibly value uncertainty, and we are not satisfied with what decision theory has to offer us, what is an alternative approach? Well, something that has come on the scene since the 1970s is the precautionary approach, or the precautionary principle for decision making. It was developed by Swedish and German legal theorists as an alternative to evidence-based methods for making public health and environmental decisions. It recommends that you should take effective action to deal with serious risks, even when scientific evidence is uncertain. Basically, evidence-based methods might recommend that you do nothing until you have more evidence. But a lot of people would say, you're dealing with global warming, or you're dealing with mad cow disease, or electromagnetic radiation from power lines. There's just things that you should be taking something to deal with risks to try to minimize your risk, even when the evidence is not all in. So this principle has been used in international treaties. It's used in Europe, but not so much in the US. It's been heavily criticized. Some people argue that it's risk averse and opposed to science, technology, and economic development because it's always focusing on taking action to avoid risks. Well, I don't think that I don't think the precautionary principle is I think it can answer these objections, that you can formulate a version of it that deals with these objections. And so this is my version of the precautionary principle. In the absence of the degree of scientific evidence required to establish accurate and precise probabilities for outcomes related to decision, so this is our lack of evidence part, take reasonable precautionary measures to avoid, minimize, or mitigate plausible and serious harms. And I'm going to talk about each one of those parts of the definition in a minute here. This principle, I would argue, can be applied to individual decisions, group decisions, or when you're making decisions for someone else, such as when you're their guardian. So plausibility. It's important that we're talking about risks that are at least plausible. Okay, you should, if you're thinking about risks and all you're saying is I want to look at every possible bad outcome that could happen from something, you end up getting into worrying about sky is falling, sort of really unrealistic scenarios. So you have to have a minimum standard of evidence here, and I would say plausibility is a good standard. To be plausible, the risk must be at least consistent with established scientific facts and theories. Reasonableness, you're making a decision that is reasonable. Reasonableness is not the same as means ends rationality, which you see in decision theory in economics and things like this. Reasonableness is more an all things considered moral or normative, overall normative assessment of the decision. You see things like reasonableness in the law and a lot of other contexts. And so that's what we have in mind here. And it's also important to keep in mind that precautionary strategies could include avoiding the risk entirely, like when you ban a chemical or you put a moratorium on some type of technology or something like that, where you just avoid a situation. Or it could be not that extreme. It could be you take steps to minimize the risk or mitigate the risk, recognizing that this risk may materialize, but you're going to try to make the best of things. What are the criteria for reasonableness? Well, here are some, I think, pretty useful criteria. These are not entirely mine alone. These have been discussed by a lot of other people, but I've sort of put them together in my principle in this way. So one of them is proportionality. So by proportionality, we mean that the balance of risks and benefits is proportional. Now, that's not something that is quantitative, it's qualitative. Basically, if you're taking a big risk, there should be a big payoff for it. That's sort of the idea there. Fairness, the measures, reasonable measures should balance benefits and risks fairly. Now, fairness includes distributive and procedural fairness. So by distributive fairness, we mean how are benefits and risks distributed in society or among all the people involved in this decision. As you know, some people in society may bear the brunt of certain kind of environmental public health risks. Others may benefit from this, get more benefits, and we have to figure out some way of making the distribution fair. Procedural fairness has to do with whether people have a meaningful involvement in the decision that affects them. So things like democracy, deliberative democracy, public engagement, community engagement, things like that are ways of building procedural fairness into the decision making. Epistemic responsibility. Reasonable measures are based on the best available evidence, knowledge, and expertise. And consistency. There should be a consistent rationale for whatever you do. So for instance, if you ban one chemical because of certain risks it imposes on public health, then if a similar chemical comes along, you should also ban it. Or if you allow one chemical, then you should also allow another. But it's basically, you have to have a consistent rationale for making your decision. And I think it's important to realize for today's discussion that these are just general criteria you can use in qualitative risk-benefit decision-making, even if you don't explicitly use the precautionary principle, you don't really like to think of it that way. These are just some ways of making reasonable precautionary decisions. So the precautionary principle involves assessment of risks and benefits, but the assessment is qualitative, not quantitative, because you're not working with known quantitative measurements of probabilities or utilities or values. And so that's where we have, the uncertainty coming in. If we could be certain, we might be able to do quantitative risk assessment, but because of our uncertainty, our risk assessment is more qualitative. I would say that the precautionary principle is a confluence of ideas from decision theory and moral theory, and some versions of it are more risk averse than mine. If you focus on avoiding risks, then you get a very risk averse sort of principle. Others are more just talk about balancing risks and benefits. So to apply this to a particular case, you have to look at the harm. Is it plausible? Is it serious? You must identify precautionary measures and apply the criteria of reasonableness to them. The criteria may conflict in some situations, and you need to prioritize whether, say, fairness is more important than proportionality or vice versa. And you might get yourself in a situation where two or more choices seem to be equally reasonable. And this is, something that people have said is a problem with this kind of reasoning, but really it's not. If you think about it, even in decision theory, you will get in situations where one or more choices seem to be recommended by the decision-making rules, and you'll have to decide which one is the best. Certainly you get into this kind of situation when you're doing moral or ethical reasoning, where it appears that one or more choices is equally good or bad from a moral point of view. So let's look at a particular example. Suppose we have a 50-year-old male patient who's concerned that he may be exposed to PFAS from drinking water. He lives outside of town and drinks well water. firefighters used PFAS chemicals to put out a fire about 2 miles from his home 3 months ago. He's read that PFAS exposure can increase the risk of high cholesterol in kidney, prostate, breast, liver, and ovarian cancer. He's concerned about cancer and high cholesterol. He has a family history of both, although his cholesterol is good, and he is about 10 pounds overweight, but is otherwise healthy. So PFAS testing is an option. There's private certified laboratories that offer blood testing for about $600, not including processing fees. Uncertified labs will charge a lot less. The patient's insurance does not cover PFAS blood testing. The patient cannot afford to pay for certified testing out of pocket, but might be able to afford uncertified testing. However, it's not clear that what could be done with the information from the test, since almost everyone has PFAS in their blood. There's no established safe or normal level of PFAS in the blood, no treatment for reducing PFAS levels in the blood, and it may not be possible to determine the route of exposure to PFAS, although the blood levels will decrease over time if exposure stops. So, what would be a reasonable precautionary measure to take in this case? Should the patient's blood be tested? Should the insurance company cover the cost of testing? And also, I might throw in there, suppose the patient's total cholesterol or LDL had increased significantly in last year without any obvious cause. As a clinician, would that strengthen your argument for PFAS blood testing? So, what are the harms? Are they plausible and serious? Well, yes, these are serious harms we're trying to avoid: cancer and high cholesterol. Are they plausible? Yes. We don't really know the probabilities that these things will occur, or the increased risk, or things like that. But we do know that these harms are consistent with established scientific facts and theories. So what are some precautions we can implement here? Well, you can do nothing. You can watch and wait. You can get your blood tested from a PFAS, from a certified lab. If the test results are positive, you can try to identify the route of exposure, such as test drinking water, take steps to reduce exposure, such as drinking bottled water. You could even get your blood tested from an uncertified lab, although you're having to deal with more issues concerning the reliability of those results. So, thinking about the proportionality of risks and benefits here, we have a sort of a ledger where we have benefits on one side and risks on the other. Benefits are taking action to identify and reduce PFAS exposure if levels are high, preventing cancer or other adverse health effects from PFAS exposure, peace of mind if your PFAS levels are okay. Knowledge of PFAS levels might be good for you in any case. You just want to know. Maybe you want to file a lawsuit if your levels are high and you're able to identify the source of the PFAS and they have deep pockets and harm can be proven. What are the risks? Well, needless worry and expense from a false positive result, false assurance from a false negative. Worry and expense, even if the test is positive and there's not much you can do. So you have this result and you really don't even know what you can do with it. The cost of testing, remediation, which may not be covered by insurance. And if your water tests positive, having to disclose this when selling the house. People don't think of this too much, but it is definitely a risk to think about when you're doing environmental testing, is this may end up in being something you have to disclose. So in terms of uncertainty now, how accurate and reliable are the tests? What are the false positive and false negative rates? Is there an established safe or normal level of PFAS in the blood? What are the risks of PFAS exposure? What is the evidence for the risks? How easy is it to identify routes of this exposure and eliminate them? Does health insurance cover blood testing? Does homeowners insurance cover water testing and remediation? So these are all uncertainties you have to work with when you're making this decision. Now, in terms of fairness, it's not so much of an issue here when it's just you involved, because we're not looking at a lot of other people in the decision, but it could become more of an issue If there are other people that are affected by your decision, such as family or guests, suppose you decided not to get PFAS testing, and then would that be unfair to the rest of your family members that might be exposed? You could think of fairness in that way. Epistemic responsibility, making a decision based on the best available evidence. And consistency, what other risks are you taking? Would it be inconsistent to be worried about PFAS exposure but not exposure to other chemicals? It's a very interesting phenomenon for individuals that people may be very inconsistent with their risk exposure and how they think about it. So on the one hand, someone might be smoking, drinking, being exposed to pesticides and taking a lot of other exposure risks, but they're worried about PFAS. So in terms of a consistency, like, well, hold it. If you're really worried about risk, you should be worried about the most risky risks that you're taking. You should put an emphasis on reducing those first, or you should be reducing all of them or whatever. Now, we usually don't criticize individuals too much for their inconsistent thinking about risks, risk exposure. But when it comes to governments now, we should demand consistency so that, if a particular chemical is banned or approved or regulated in a certain way by the government, then chemicals that are similar to that chemical in various ways should be treated in basically the same way. Let's see.
David, I just wanted to check if you're close to being done. We're pretty tight on time.
Yeah, we are close to being done. Okay, so going to group decision making, we have questions that come up here if we apply the precautionary principle. Should PFAS blood testing be legal? It is in the United States, but there could be FDA issues if it's used for diagnosis or prevention of disease. You'd have to look at whether the benefits of the testing outweigh the risks and what the evidence are. Should health insurance cover PFAS testing? Governments, what are the social costs and benefits in testing? How are these distributed? Should homeowners insurance cover PFAS water testing and remediation? Now, when you start looking at this from a group perspective, not just the individual making a decision, things get much, much more complicated because you're talking about questions of social benefits and risks, questions of social fairness, social justice, distribution of risks and benefits, limited resources, and we have widespread moral disagreement, moral pluralism, politics gets into it, and so forth. So it could become a very messy situation when you're looking at it from a group decision-making perspective. I think it's an entirely reasonable policy to say that if individuals want to pursue testing at their own expense, but not requires others to pay for it, this could be procedurally fair. It could be reasonable to allow individuals to get testing, but not require others to pay for it if this policy is adopted by a fair democratic process. And it's consistent with similar policies and based on the best available evidence. But this could change, of course, as people change their minds, more evidence becomes available and so forth. So just sort of a big picture here. What I would say is that you can use the precautionary principle as sort of in complementing other principles. The argument for using expected utility theory and its offshoots is highest when you have low scientific uncertainty and low moral uncertainty. The argument for using the precautionary principle, however, is highest when scientific and moral uncertainty are both high. And it could be reasonable to switch decision-making strategies. You could start out using the precautionary principle, and then as you gain more knowledge and values get clarified, you could switch to something like expected utility theory as you reduce your uncertainty. Okay, so this is all comes out of my book, just to make it clear that this is where a lot of this presentation comes from. So I'm going to stop there, and I hope I haven't taken up too much time.